to Associate Pastor Greg Lloyd, and you're the youth pastor here.
So youth and kids. Campus. So I oversee youth and kids. So, or you can say next generation. Kind of sounds cooler. I think stuff like that. Okay.
All right.
Awesome.
Do we have a speaker? I mean, a microphone.
A microphone? I only have is this little one, but I think it just goes to the other campuses. All right. So no microphone. Here we go. Yeah. Good chest. What's that? I'm good. If you, hey, can you hear me back there in the back? Yeah. I don't know. You want me to get a, do you guys want me to have a mic, or are you guys okay with me like this? Okay, yes means what? Mic. Okay. They say yes for the mic. I asked you an either or, you gave me a yes. I don't know what that means. All right. All right, before we start, let me introduce you to Sarah. Sarah's a PST. How many people know Sarah? How many people don't know Sarah? Okay, you all need to introduce yourself to Sarah. Make sure that you know her, okay, right? Part of being pastoral support team is part of being community. Now, she's going to introduce me.
Okay,
ready?
So everyone, this is our Associate Youth and Kids Pastor, Greg Lloyd. And, and I've been asked to open us up in prayer, so if we can all just stand up and bow our heads. Dear Abba, we thank you for this opportunity to gather in your name and to learn more about how we can just come together as a community to reach out to everyone who is hurting and everyone that you bring into our path in order for us to share what you have done for us and to give you all of the glory and to just spread the love that you have poured into us and to share the good news of the gospel and to just be able to be a part of your body, Father. We thank you so much. We pray that you just pour the Holy Spirit over all of us and in this room, and may your love and your word be uplifted and emphasized in everything we do today. And we pray that you keep us with a humble heart, with a willing heart, and with a grateful heart, Father. We thank you so much. In your precious name we pray, amen.
Amen. Awesome. Give it up for Sarah. Awesome, man. You gave me, I got the Janet Jackson mic. Check me out. Look at that. Check it. 1, 2. Wow. This is pretty cool. All right. Y'all hear me now? Hear me now good? Great. Check 3, 4. No feedback coming from the dueling mics with everybody else out there, Joe? Yeah, we're good. So everybody give it up for Joe, my technical director. Woo! Yeah. Joe's also a classmate of mine, so we also are both in Azusa Pacific right now. So, yeah, good old APU. Awesome. So, just to give you a little more background on myself, my name is Greg Lloyd. At least I hope so. I'm wearing his shirt. But I've been on staff here for going on about 5 years now, a little over 5 years. I'm the Associate Campus Pastor of Youth and Kids. I didn't start off doing that. I started off with Rock U. If you guys all remember, anybody remember Rock U? Yeah, Donna. See, Donna was there. She was part of that. Rock U, which was kind of a bridge of classes between Impact 195 or the Rock School of Ministry and just kind of things in general. We did foundations classes as well as any one of a number of different ones. We did New Testament survey, all kinds of great stuff. I did a little stint in life groups for a while, and then about a little over a year ago, I was asked to kind of oversee Next Generation. So I'm super excited. I love doing what I'm doing. One of the things that I absolutely love is to teach. And so when they asked me if I would teach here, I said, absolutely, I would love to. So this will be an interactive class, and we're going to have a great time as we go through with that. Am I going to get questions from the other campuses? Do they do any chiming in or anything like that? Sometimes. Only if I say something heretical, I'm sure East County will probably be like, what? I'll like actually hear them coming, right? See, I know you guys are watching me, and that's good. I like that. Anyways, all right, so let's start off. How many people are dreading this? How many people think this is the next 4 weeks of dry and anything like that? Well, I'm hoping that it's not going to be. I'm hoping that it's going to be something that's going to be exciting and interesting for you, because let me ask you this. Let's say so before I was a pastor, I probably just nailed them with the sound as I hit my chest. Before I was a pastor, I worked for 18 years in San Diego Fire Department. I retired, took an early retirement to be in the pastoral ministry. And imagine if you didn't know anything about history of the fire department or anything like that, and all of a sudden you picked up a book, and they started talking about things like Dalmatians, right? Everybody knows like fire departments and Dalmatians, right? All of those types of things. And you just start going, okay, I want to start doing stuff with the fire department. And I looked and I read this book, and they're talking about Dalmatians all through the book. And they're like, okay, I need to get a Dalmatian. So you get it in, and you're going around, and you're looking at it, and you bring it into the station, and you're like, wow, this is kind of cool. What's it do? Well, it barks, it eats, it poops, It's really actually more of a pain than it's worth. Why would I want to deal with this? What's the purpose of this? And if you don't understand what the purpose of a Dalmatian was, and you don't understand where it fits into there. For those of you that don't know, Dalmatians were never intended to be with fire trucks as far as mechanized fire engines. The Dalmatians were designed to be around the fire trucks when they were pulled by horses. And if you can imagine being in the time that those horse-drawn carriages of fire trucks were around, there wasn't a lot of the main conveniences of the area. They didn't have animal control. They didn't have sanitation. They didn't have your animal shelters and all of those different things. And so what you had in the streets were a lot of stray dogs. And the stray dogs would chase the horses and would scare the horses and spook the horses. It's one thing to be a single rider on a horse and get spooked and get knocked off. But if you're pulling, a several 100-pound trailer on the way to a fire to help somebody, and all of a sudden have your horse spooked, and then the carriage goes, that's a lot of money, and plus that could hurt some people. So the Dalmatians were actually designed to run around and run ahead of the horses to chase off the other dogs. And that's why you see, because so many people they're like, oh man, I love firefighters. I'd love to get a Dalmatian. They'd be so great with my little kids. And then they realize Dalmatians aren't really good with little kids. They're really hyper. They're really kind of edgy, and they're not great. Well, they were never designed they weren't the pet dog as they become into. There was a purpose behind them. Why do I say this? Why is this important? How does this translate to New Testament survey? What do you think? Like, what? There were firefighters in the Bible? You're missing it. Come on. We should have got a little more Starbucks, right? The whole idea behind this is that if you don't understand the time frame and what's going on in the land and what are the traditions and what is the culture and what are the people doing, you're going to miss the purposes for a lot of things that are going on there. Paul writes in one of his epistles that you shouldn't braid your hair. Anybody got braided hair in here? Donna? You got it braided? Like, was Donna in sin? Yeah, see, you guys are horrible. Donna's not in sin, okay, just so you know, okay? Right? No, she's not. Because if you were to know that from those times in that when you braided hair, the women that braided their hair on the time actually braided strands of gold into their hair, and it was a sign of vanity and a sign of over the top, hey, look at me, and to draw attention to yourself. But what you want to look at is to look beyond the surface and get down into the deeper and the purpose behind, which what Paul was saying was you're not supposed to be attracted to the outside, but be looking at what God is doing inside your heart. But unless you understand the culture, unless you understand the times, unless you understand those things that are going on, you're going to, one, miss some things, or two, you're literally going to be scratching the surface of the scriptures. And I'm going to tell you that it's so important for us to understand that. And the other thing you need to understand at the time is that this is so more important too for us as Christians, because you know what we do with the Bible sometimes? We idolize the Bible. That the Bible actually becomes the idol. Do you realize that back in the New Testament times when Jesus was around and all of the apostles and Paul, they didn't have the New Testament. You know? They couldn't sing, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. And it sounds funny to hear that, but when you think of, you got to think about this. That the reason those people were doing what they were doing, willing to die, willing to go before and challenge the local government, why they were willing to do that wasn't because they saw something written down. And we're going to find out as we start to look deeper on into when these epistles were written, when the letters were written, when the gospels were written, and all of those things, we're going to start to realize that those were written a little bit later on. But the reason that you and I are here today, the reason that those people were willing to die wasn't because of something they read in a book. It was because it was something they witnessed with their own eyes. You see, because you got to recognize that I'm going to tell you right now that at the point where Jesus went to the cross, how many disciples were there? None. Because if there were disciples, if there were true believers and followers of Christ and what he said and what he claimed, they would have all been standing at the tomb on Sunday morning going, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Right? They would have been waiting there. There wasn't anybody there. Some had gone back to fishing. Some were hiding. When the women that came to there, they weren't coming to look for a resurrected Lord. They were coming to anoint a body because he had been hastily buried. And they were coming to anoint a dead. They were looking for a dead man. So much so that when Jesus appeared to them, they thought he was the gardener. They're like, hey, yeah, can you help us out over here? Pull some weeds? That looks kind of, no. You're right? That something happened that took people that didn't believe and turned them into people not only that believe, but were willing to die for their faith. And so understanding the background and everything that happens within here, one, gives you such a depth of the richness behind what's taking place. And so that we're going to be here for the next 4 weeks, okay? And this is a place where I want to encourage you to engage and ask questions as we go through these different things, kind of tie it in. I know there's a few people that are going to Israel, so they're going to miss some stuff, but I'd encourage you, if there's a recording, you can get it, because you're going to see all of that stuff and you're going to be able to chance to live it. I've been to Israel 3 times myself. I love it. My last time I went, so 2 times I led tours there, just as a pastor, part of either the Rock School of Ministry or part of the church in general through Rock U. The last time I took my 14-year-old son and we rented a car and we just drove all over Israel, and it was awesome. And we had a great time. Regardless of where he is at spiritually right now, that 10 days that we spent together is gonna, I know, will stick in his mind for the rest of his life. And so it'll always be something that he can go back to. And I would encourage any of you, if you've never been to Israel, you need to go. You need to go. It just gives you an understanding and a richness and a background to the scriptures that you can't do with anything else. So we're going to talk about that. So we're going to do a general overview and some of the purposes and those things today. Next week we'll be talking about the synoptics or the gospels, followed by the epistles. So there's the Pauline epistles as well as the general epistles, and then we'll round off with apocalyptic literature or basically Revelation. And then in talking about that, and at the very end, I'm going to do something super simple, which is great. Has anybody ever heard of Walk Through the Bible? No. Okay, you've heard of it? Yeah, it's old school, huh? I mean, it's cool, because what it's going to do, if for anything else, if you don't learn anything else from this class, you're going to learn basically all the books of the New Testament and what the themes are. So if you don't learn anything else, you're going to at least know what's the theme of James, what's the theme of 1 Thessalonians, what's this, and all of that stuff. So we'll end with that. It's cool. It's kind of a word association thing where it gives you a visual as well as something that you can repeat. But we're going to start off deep, and then we're going to go surfacey at the end of that. What's that? You can lead the song for that. But we might do it a little differently, because I do the Walk Through the Bible based in chronological order of the New Testament. So we'll see how that goes. But we'll have you lead that if it goes through that. So we see the importance of it. We're going to go through that. So we're going to talk about 4 things today. right? As we get through, and we might go even a little bit deeper in that. But there are 4 essences in talking about culture when we're talking about the distinct features as we go through as far as first century Israel and those things. We talk about that. So the 4 things are the temple, the land, the Torah, and the people. Okay? The temple, the land, the Torah, and the people. So let's talk about the temple, right? What do we know about the temple? Tell me, what do you know about the temple in this time? So we're talking about the time basically from about, let's just say about 100 BC to about 100 AD. What's that? So who built the temple? Who built this temple? Do we know which number the temple is in this? What's that? Herod built it? How many believe Herod built the temple? Or did you say Harold? Harold. No. It was Harold. You know. Was that? You believe Herod built it? Yes. Oh, we got to shake her. She's like, no, I know. What is it? Tell me. What's that? Solomon? Everybody, Solomon. Solomon. We got Solomon too. We got, what was that? Okay, so this might help. Go ahead. Come on, I hear your hand. Come on. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So there was that term. Oh. See some other hands going. I'll go this side of the room. Okay. So you got it backwards, but you're right. So Ezra rebuilt the temple. So we are in the second temple period. So the first temple, yes, built by Solomon, destroyed by the Babylonians and Assyrian Babylon. So the Babylonians. So let's back up a little bit, just so you guys got to get into a little bit of an understanding. And we won't go into a whole Old Testament survey, but you need to understand this because everything points through and it's all related. And so many of you, and I don't say so many of you, I don't want to make an assumption, but so many people in general, they're like, oh my gosh, man, the Middle East is in turmoil. Oh my gosh. Our land, the Middle East, gosh, it's just in turmoil. And man, and then even today in the streets and things that are going on, and man, there's so much compromise within Christianity, and there's so many, it's like people are wanting to be tolerant of others and stuff like that. And I'm going to tell you, as you're going to learn through this, it's nothing new. It's nothing new. There is nothing new under the sun. The Middle East has been in turmoil, continue to be in turmoil. There's still a cycle, as you're going to see. And if you guys have had church history yet? No, so you'll have church history and you'll realize there's a cycle within the church. And it should be very interesting, and I'll just give you the little heads up, is that as the church becomes popular and is successful, it gets watered down and it actually suffers. But when the church suffers persecution, it actually grows and gets stronger. And it's just really amazing to watch that, and that's just part of who God serves. So, tracing back in time, Solomon built the first temple, and then what we had is remember, so Solomon built the first temple, then we have Solomon's sons, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, right? Rehoboam came in to be king. Although people blame him for the split in the divided kingdom, he probably wasn't the only one. But he's the guy that gets blamed for it, and part of it is the fact that, and it's a great thing about listening to your elders or listening to your friends. Right, and so to not go too far into that, but Rehoboam listened to the elders. They basically said, your dad taxed everybody so much, if you give him a break, you will win the people forever. And then he went to his buddies and like, no, dude, this is our time. We're getting paid. Tax it up. And that's what he said. And he listened to his friends, and he didn't listen to the elders. And he ended up taxing. Kingdom divides into what? Israel and Judah. Right? And so Judah stays in the south where Jerusalem is. Jerusalem stays the center of worship for there. Israel moves up to the north. Okay? And then you have a different place of worship and all that, but the kingdom is divided. Israel has no real good kings. And they end up falling pretty quickly to the Assyrians. Judah has a few good kings. It saves it a couple hundred years more. We get into about 500 BC, and we have the Babylonians come in. The Babylonian captivity comes in. Babylonians take over. They cart some people off to Babylon. Anybody know who? Yeah. And who else? 3 more dudes. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? So they go get carted off to Babylon. And you see that going through there in those aspects. And then Babylon happens. They're going through that captivity, but then in the midst of that, somebody comes in and takes over from the Babylonians. So remember, we had Nebuchadnezzar and we had his guy. His son was in there. He's drinking. He took all of the stuff from the temple. He's having a crazy wild party. And you have the handwriting on the wall, right? Which says, Mene, Mene, Tekel Upharsi, which means you have been weighed and found wanting. And because he disgraced the Lord in that night, the Babylonians get taken over by the Medes and the Persians. So then you have the Medes and the Persian captivity, which then brings us into around 400 AD, and Cyrus, right? Cyrus the Great comes in with his Cyrus decree, which shows that people who don't even believe in God can be used by God. Oh, what? Yes?
Cyrus is actually talked about in the Bible like
Isaiah, absolutely, yeah. Talk to him by name. So the Cyrus decree, which is interesting in that you can look into that even further and deeper. Cyrus decree comes, which allows some of the Jews that were deported to return to Jerusalem. And at that point, Ezra comes and he starts to rebuild the temple. And then they rebuild the temple, and that kind of takes place. There's a little bit of a delay with some problems and all that, but it ends up going through. But you now have a temple, and really more importantly, Ezra's focus was not to build a temple, but to build a community. And we'll talk about community being surrounded in that, and the temple's impact of that when we get into our parts here. Next after that, you have Nehemiah coming in. Nehemiah was the cupbearer for the king, right? He was the cupbearer for the king, so he was in a very close. And cupbearer, without getting too much into Nehemiah, it's more than what you think. So people think cupbearer is like you're the dude that tastes the wine before the king, so you get poisoned, the king doesn't. So think about him as he was the event planner. For everything that the king would do, he was the event planner. And you got to imagine that every day was probably a feast for the king. So he had strategy. He had know how to get things done. He was a great person. He went in and went and rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. So he and led a group of people to go back, rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. So there they are in this phase that we get into about 400 AD. And 400 AD is where you would start what's called the intertestamental period. The intertestamental period, it ends with Malachi, right? So this 400 years of silence, has anybody ever heard about that? 400 years of silence. It doesn't mean nothing happened. What? Exactly. It doesn't mean nothing happened. A lot of stuff happened. A lot of very important stuff happened. And we'll talk about that as we move through. But basically, to give you an understanding, about 400 AD to about 5 or 400 BC to about 5 or 6 AD, you have this intertestamental period. What happens in that time? What happens in that time is the Medes and the Persians fall to the Macedonians or the Greeks, where you start to see a lot of Greek philosophy starting to come in, and the Greeks come and they take over the area. And if you haven't, and looking at that, and then so Alexander the Great conquers Israel in that area, and then ends up dying within about 10 or so years after that, after conquering the area. What they did as a result of that was divide his kingdom to the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And the Seleucids and the Seleucids were in the north and the Ptolemies were in the south. And so they divided that area, and there was still some war over Israel. Israel is a very strategic area. And we'll talk about that for a number of reasons as we go through there. But what happens with the Ptolemies is one of the kings of Ptolemies, he starts the library at Alexandria. Has anybody ever heard of that? So a library at Alexandria was this, so, the Greeks were very much into knowledge and very much into understanding intolerance of different things that were going around. And so he asked for, I can't remember what the exact number is, but some of the best and brightest scribes from the nation of Israel to come down and translate the Old Testament. Actually, I do know how many. Does anybody know how many there were? Yes. 70. Why do we know there's 70? Because it's called the Septuagint. Does everybody know the Septuagint? The Septuagint is the 70 scholars that were, traditionally known to have translated the Old Testament scriptures into Greek. So the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek. Why is that important?
Because Greek is the New Testament writing.
Because the Greek's the New Testament's writing, but it hasn't been written yet. Yes. What's that? Right. Yeah, so we have interpretation, right? We have that. Yes. Okay, yes.
Because Greek and Roman empires took over, the common language is Greek. So in order to be like Catholic learning Latin now, or instead of learning Latin, they had it language to use.
Absolutely. And how does that, so what does that mean for us as we're going through New Testament survey? So is Christianity a new religion? No. What is it based off of?
Facts.
Okay, so you said, with the what?
Eyewitness counts.
Oh, so it's accounts. The Torah, Judaism, right? Right. Christianity they never looked at themselves as a totally new religion, did they? They looked at themselves as the completion of the Messiah, of Judaism, the promise of the Messiah. They looked at that. That's the way they looked at it. They didn't separate, and we'll find that they didn't really even want to separate later on. They were separated more for political reasons than other things. But the idea is that looking at it, that God was already laying the foundation for the gospel 100 years before Jesus ever set foot on the earth. I mean, he even more him with the prophecies. So you have all of the prophecies from Israel, from Isaiah, and all of those things, but also not only working prophetically, supernaturally, he's also working practically. So he's already so when all of these Greeks would come to know, they could go, hey, look to a Greek version of the Old Testament to get all of the history and information on the nation of Israel. And that was around 150 BC and all of those types of things. So you see those things coming on. One of the other things that happened in there, we'll talk about Antiochus Epiphanes. Anybody know who Antiochus Epiphanes is? Antiochus Epiphanes, besides you, what's your name? Aston. Okay, besides Aston, no. They're like, Aston's got that. No. Antiochus Epiphanes actually came into the temple and basically sacrificed, made a sacrifice inside of the temple. He's a Gentile. He's all of that, and would be considered what they would call the abomination of desolation. He sacrificed inside of the temple. And that starts what's called the Maccabean, kind of the beginnings of the Maccabean revolt. Did you realize that he wasn't the first person in there? There was actually a general that went in prior to him. And this is very interesting because this general, he didn't do anything as outrageous as Antiochus Epiphanes did, but he actually walked into the Holy of Holies, which is huge for Jews, right? Because why is that important? Why is that huge for Jews? So Moses, no, but yes.
So only the high priest, who was allowed at one time a year to enter that holy chamber. Like you said that, so the curse against it was, should you go in and not be the high priest, should be struck down.
Exactly.
You're saying he wasn't struck down?
Nope. Interesting, isn't it? So he was a general, went into the Holy of Holies, went in, walked around, was surprised because, one, he had heard all the accounts, And two, he's surprised he walked in there. He's looking for something because what was the temple representative of? The presence, God's presence. Remember, you remember with the tabernacle in the Old Testament and coming down that God's presence came and resided and rested on the tabernacle, the cloud, the pillar, all of those things. So the Jews looked at the temple as literally the very presence of God being in there. He walks in, one, doesn't die, and two, what does he find? Nothing. Nothing. He's surprised when he walks in because he's like, there's nothing here. And he's like going, what's going on? A very interesting point when you start to think about this and about the presence of God. And this is a point where God is starting to say that my presence is moving from being in one place in one location where people have to come to now moving out into the community and being a part and going through that. So why didn't he die? Well, it's really kind of a prophecy towards that God's presence had already left, which was kind of interesting. So it kind of goes along with this 400 years of silence, not hearing anybody speak from the Lord. The Lord's presence, in essence, has left. But the temple still plays a pretty significant role in that, in the whole, as we're walking through this. No, I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is, so you can't think like a Jew. You have to think like a Greek. So I'm looking for a statue. I'm looking for something significant that shows me like what this God looks like, what he's interpreted as, or something like that. So yeah, so the table of showbread was probably in there. The altar of incense was probably in there. You know, whether or not the Ark of the Covenant was in there, we're not quite sure. But nothing to point himself to God's presence or something like that of specific and those types of things.
That's a question. This is sort of going back. You had said that was considered the abomination of desolation. Some people believe that hasn't happened yet.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. So what you're going to find too, which is really interesting about prophecy in Scripture, is you're going to find the whole now and not yet. So there are certain prophecies that look like they're fulfilled, and then there's this now and then not yet perspective to prophecy. However, what I do want to caution everybody with, and we'll get into this when we talk about apocalyptic literature, is the idea that prophecies are always looked at as fulfilled looking back. So you'll see that through the Gospels and through different areas that they'll say, and he did this so that Scripture might be fulfilled. So the whole idea is that, and we always get prophecy backwards. So instead of saying the prophecy was fulfilled, looking back, this is fulfilled, I'm looking back going, oh, this is when it got fulfilled. We always go like this, we stand back and we go, oh, I wonder when it's going to happen. So we start at the prophecy and look forward trying to figure out when it's fulfilled. That's why dudes get all off track and they say Jesus is coming back on May 28th, 2014. Right? Or the world's going to end on this day, because they're looking at prophecies from the wrong end. They're looking at them trying to look forward and predict something, not look at fulfillment looking back as a confirmation of the promises that God has. And those things. So good question. So let's talk about the Torah, right? What is the Torah? Actually, I'm sorry, we were on temple right now. So temple. So we're in the Second Temple era. So Ezra and Nehemiah built the first temple. Herod did improve upon it. He did improve upon it. So sometimes there are some people that will call that Third Temple or all of those things. But most people believe, most Jews believe, that they were in the Second Temple era during the Intertestamental or during the New Testament period, which ends at 70 AD in the destruction of the Second Temple. So you know that's asking you if you build a house and are you completed with your house. You know, I mean, you know. Well, I would say that so it's completed to the sense that we know that sacrificial practices began again. We do know that Herod improved and enlarged the temple considerably. And we'll talk about that. So Herod is half Jewish. Okay, not to say that Herod has any type of piety to him whatsoever, but Herod's a smart guy. Okay, Herod's a really smart guy. So we're talking about the politics of what's going on here in first century. He's Idumean. He's half Jew. He actually marries a lady who's part Jewish as well, one of his wives. But he's a guy that, you know, he's trying to hold on to an area that really technically doesn't belong to him. It's Roman rule. He's trying to put himself in a position so that if they leave him, that they'll leave him alone, and he'll rule the area. Remember that he considered himself king of the Jews, which is the very interesting point when we talk about with that. So the beginning, so Ezra and Nehemiah built that, and then in order to understand Judaism, you got to understand the temple, right? So the temple was so important to Judaism, so important to first century Judaism. Okay, it was a central place. It was something that united the Jews, and the Jews were in an area which they would call the diaspora. Okay, the diaspora, which means the scattering. Okay, and you'll hear about that with first and second century Christianity in the diaspora, where Christians are scattered all throughout Europe and in those particular areas. But you got to remember that not everybody came back from Babylon. Not everybody came back from Assyria. You know, there was a certain significant number, but there were people that were like, you know what, I'm okay being this far away. But the temple represented something to them. It represented a unifying perspective or a unifying place that said, this is why we're Jews. We have the temple. So we're completing it. Starting the sacrificial system again was super important to them. It was a place that they got to return multiple times a year, or maybe even once a year that came back. So with all of the festivals, right, that would come through in the Jewish calendar, they would come to Israel, or they would come to Jerusalem specifically, to the temple. You're talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands of people coming into the city during those festivals. Now, I've been able to, you know, the second time I went to Israel, we went during I think it was Greek Orthodox, thought it was the Greek Orthodox Easter, which was about a month after ours. And I mean, it's crazy. There's people everywhere. You know, pilgrimages. So you have these people making pilgrimages to identify with their religion. So it was a magnificent building. It was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world, and it was a sacrificial center. It's still considered the presence of God. They just looked at that like that's where he would be, even with the mix of everything that had happened. They were still looking at it as the central place of the sacrificial system and a unifying symbol. It was not only a religious influence, but it was an economic powerhouse. So economically, the temple was something very strong. So you can imagine all of the tithes and all of the offerings. You sent your tithes and offerings from, if you considered yourself a religious Jew, you sent your tithes and offerings to the temple in Jerusalem. You also had all of those, the sacrifices and all of that. You got to remember, too, you have thousands of people that are staying there. They got to have a place to stay. You know? Has everybody ever been here, been around when there's Comic-Con? And you guys realize that Comic-Con is the only convention to fill the entire convention center. So there's like sections like A through J. And most times when you go to a convention there, they take like 1 or 2 meeting halls. Comic-Con is like the whole, literally, I think it's like a quarter to a third of a mile long. Just vendors after vendors after vendors. And all of the hotels book up. And if you've ever, and I used to, when I was working with the fire department, I used to do bike patrol down there. and trying to navigate, I mean, literally wall to wall people and like honking, like get out of the way, like honk, honk, just trying to weave through. And that's not even if there was an emergency. But I mean, it's literally wall to wall people. So you can imagine that in Jerusalem, you know, at these times during the year, during these feasts or these festivals where people were making pilgrimages in there, you've got wall to wall people. And so you got to have places for them to stay and places for them to eat and places for the, you know, for them to purchase different things. So economically, it was huge, you know, and just, which is just very interesting as you talk about different things like in the Gospels when, you know, he you know, when Jesus turned over the money changers tables and all of that. It was also a military and a political power, right? Or, you know, so just the temple itself, it's sitting on the hill. It's the highest point in time, in the times. It's very difficult to access. You know, the Romans in finding that out, that it was, you know, when they decided to finally take over and destroy, it was hard to get to the temple. So it was a very political and strategic place in those. It was definitely, you know, it was something that was of strategic importance to the military. So we got the temple, right? So that's the temple, what it represents in first century and all of those things. And now we talk about the land. So the land. So what's important about land? What do you think? Okay, location. So let's talk about location. What's important about the location of Israel? Anybody know? Yes.
It's where the new heaven will fall.
Okay. Let's stay in first century. It's all right. It's a good point. In the way back. Sheep and pasture land, okay. So yeah, so it was a very agricultural community and those things.
And then it was a very access was.
Okay, spend more specifically, get more into that.
Trade,
Okay, what?
sea, land.
Okay, right. Do you guys realize, and if you, is that that the gateway to the west into Europe, into those areas, all went through Israel? So the gold road from Africa to get up into the north went through Israel. The spice road, right? And the tea road and the silk road from the east, from China, from India, all came west through there and then cut up right through there or dumped at the Mediterranean Sea to go through there. It's very, very amazing how what a strategic place that little strip of land is. It's smaller. You know, it's significantly smaller than California. You can literally drive in 3 hours, drive from the east border to the west border. You can drive from the south to the north in about 6 to 7 hours. It's a small country. It's very small, but it's super significant. What a better place to land the gospel than in a place where all trade routes and roads run through it. And it's just very, very interesting in that. So yes, you have that, so significance in terms of trade as far as that go, lots of people moving through. But let's start to think about the Jews in terms of an identity. Okay, what do you use? So what are some of the things that you use to identify yourself? Okay, so if you say, like, say, describe who you are, what would you say? Because I'm proud to be an American, right? Right? How much identity could you say if you don't live, you know, that if you didn't have, if you say, great, you're American, where's that? You're like, oh, I don't know. I don't really have a land. I don't really have a place. Land is huge. Land is huge. Uh-oh, question. Land is such a huge part of identity. And so you can see why the Jews were so much, you know, they wanted to have that land. Why they were so desperate for a Messiah to free them from Roman. Because you imagine being in Israel, you know, you're waking up and you're like, you know, man, I'm Hebrew, and then you walk out and you're standing face to face with a Roman guard. You're walking down the street, right? And you know, or you're walking down one road, and a Roman soldier comes up to you and goes, hey man, hey, carry my pack. And you have to do it. You know, or I gotta pay a tax to Rome. That land was so much a part of your identity. Can you just imagine this whole aspect of having to pay and having to be in an occupied nation? They were longing for freedom. They were longing for freedom. We see that, and they enjoyed a short period of freedom in the intertestamental period. After the Medes and the Persians, before the Greeks came in, they kind of enjoyed a little bit of their own freedom, but it wasn't long lasting. The Greeks came in, they took them over. But what you see within the land is, when Antiochus Epiphanes came in, the Maccabean revolt. And you can learn about all of these things, and I encourage you, where you get some of the books that are listed within this is called the Apocrypha. You're like, oh my gosh, what the Apocrypha, Okay, yes, they're considered uninspired books, but they certainly give some historical background. And so as you realize that that they may be descriptive, not prescriptive, okay? So they describe some of the events that are going on in the time, but they're necessarily prescriptive as far as giving you, ideas on how to live out the heart of God in your daily life. But the whole idea, so what you have in there in a short one is the Maccabean revolt. So Judas Maccabees just starts the revolt as a result of Antiochus Epiphanes and the things that they've done, and they successfully revolted. And they were able to find some freedom during that time. And be able to find, but that was short-lived because being so strategic, Romans came in and all of that, and they were taken over. So you have a people that it's like, man, they've kind of tasted freedom. They were longing for the good old days, the days of David and Solomon, where they were at the height of who they were. You imagine that, you being like one of the biggest powers in the area, and then all of a sudden going down to kind of being kicked around by everybody else. And just what that feels like for you in those types of things. And then we talk about the people. And we've talked about some of the people that are around, some of the people that are taking place. The Greeks, the Seleucids and Ptolemies, and they're divided in the area. And then eventually the Romans come in, and you have what's called Pax Romana. Pax Romana, which is Roman peace. And they got to enjoy some of those parts of Roman peace, right? You got Big Brother. Yeah, he's occupying you, he's taking control, but he's also protecting you from some of the things. And there's a little, there's this false sense of peace going on in the area. And what happens to the people when the big power comes in? There's a division. There's a division between the people that want to get along. A division between the people that want to get along and the people that want to stay true to who they are. And so you have these people that come along and they say, hey, I'm just going to side with whoever's in power at the time. Hey, I just need to be relevant. Maybe the Torah and the old Judaism and all of that stuff, that was great 1,000 years ago, but man, we're coming on the, 200, 100 BC. This is like the times. Like we need to be more modern. We need to be more relevant. We got to reach the younger generation. We've got all of this Greek philosophy coming in and all of this knowledge and all of these great things that are happening. Yeah, they got a few gods here and there. But they're really just kind of more towards kind of praying to somebody to look for a better path in life, right? Right? This is a government. I mean, we can either go against them and have a whole bunch of difficulty, or we can go kind of with them, right? Because you remember, like Judaism, as opposed to a lot of the other religions, is very exclusionary. Judaism talks about things that separate you apart. What can't you eat? What can't you do? The whole fact of taking a Sabbath off and not doing anything on a certain day, just doing nothing, was foreign to a lot of these people. They're like, what are you talking about? What do you mean you can't eat meat? What do you mean you can't mix this with this? What do you mean you have to do all of those types of things? People are going, wait a second, okay, I'm confused now. They're saying you guys are so way out on the outskirts. Your rules are so exclusionary. Like, I don't even know how you can do it. So this puts the Jews in a point of contention at the time. So now they have a people that start to adopt some of the Greek ways. And you have an advance of what's called Hellenism into the intertestamental. And why am I picking all of these words up? Because they're in the New Testament, and to get an understanding of the background behind it means that you're going to not be a Passover Christian. You guys know what a Passover Christian is, right? Oh man, I don't understand that word. Oh, I'll just pass over it. All right, let me read again. Wait, let me find out. Okay, I got this. Oh man, I don't understand. Okay, I'm just going to pass over that part. Right? And you realize that there isn't a single, God was very intentional about every word that he lays out. And he's very intentional about all of those, about everything. And so getting that understanding. So talking about Hellenism and what is that coming in, and that Hellenism is the blending of Greek philosophy, Greek culture, and Greek ideals within Judaism. And what happens is you have a division in the Jews. You have a division of those who really kind of want to side and get along. And then you have those that want to be more ultra-Orthodox and want to follow their own ones. The two groups that they kind of divide into are probably ones that you're very familiar with. And they would be the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So when we start to talk about people going into this aspect, we're talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees, the big difference was the Sadducees said, we are going to hold to the Torah. That our scriptures, our beliefs, that what we're going to adhere to are the Torah. Does anybody know what the Torah is? Also known as the Pentateuch. Penta means what? 5. First 5 books of the Bible. Right? So they don't take into account any of the prophets or anything like that. Why do they do that? Because that is the most, it's the most narrowest form. It's the least, it's the basics. And then so the idea is that if they just take the basics, it's a whole lot easier to add in the extras. It's a whole lot easier to add in some of the Greek philosophy and all that, because the Torah is like, well, it doesn't really talk about that. Oh, okay, then I can kind of add that in. And they end up going to do that. One of the things you're going to hear about in the Sadducees is that they don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. Okay, you'll hear Jesus talk about that. And if you look at the Torah, there's really nothing mentioned much about that. There's one little verse out of Exodus, and actually Jesus points to that verse, which talks about all about how Jesus addresses people where they're at. But the idea is, and if you think about in Greek philosophy about getting, they're like raising from a dead, that's kind of gross. Like raise up from the dead? What? Yeah. I mean, it's like we're talking, you thought zombies were a new thing, right? They're like talking like, it's like, like what they didn't understand the whole perspective. So to them, it was repulsive. And so you see, so the Sadducees, the Sadducees were part of the high priesthood. The Sadducees were part of the high priesthood. And they were more of the elite of society. They were the rich. They were the ones that were the privileged. So why is this important to get along in this? Why do you think they tended to more side with who's in power? If you're wealthy, what's your number one goal? Stay wealthy. And you realize that this isn't get conquered. You remember this whole time in the area is getting conquered. It's like, hey, we'd really love for you to move out of your place. You can sell it to us and we'll pay you a little bit for it. It's like, oh no, you're conquered. Oh, you're not for us. Okay. Either get out or I'm going to kill you and your family and throw you out. So the whole perspective of this is they had a lot to lose, right? They had a lot to lose at the time. So they're going to side with that versus than the others. Yes. That's a great question. No. And so what happens is, and as we'll talk about here in a little bit, is that the Sadducees become less and less, it's their compromise really eventually leads to their destruction in that. So we'll talk about that even a little more as we go through. So this is really interesting to look at, because the Sadducees, although they're part of the ruling class, they're the minority. There's not as many of them, because really to be a Sadducee was more like you had to be born into it. You couldn't study to be a Sadducee. You could study to be a Pharisee, but you couldn't study to be a Sadducee because you had to really kind of be born in it. It was an elitist kind of thing. They were the upper crust, the rich and famous, but they became less and less influential as you see that. That's why you see, like when you see the Pharisees are dealing with Jesus out in the field, out in the land, and the Sadducees are where he's dealing with either in Jerusalem or in the temple or in the Sanhedrin and all of those types of things and perspectives there. So with that, you have this division. Okay, so the division happens within the Sadducees and the Pharisees in going through with that. They're part of the high priest. They're trying to get along in all of that. So remember that part when we start to deal with some of the other people. So the Pharisees go the other direction. The Pharisees develop, in addition, so they believe in the Torah, they believe in the prophets and all of those things, but they develop something else called the oral Torah. The oral Torah, which is ways to be able to follow the Torah, just kind of general guidelines in life. And so if you ever talked about the Jesus speaking about traditions elevated to the level of doctrine, and that when he talks about that in Mark, and as well as in some of the other Gospels, this is exactly what he's speaking to. Anybody know how many laws the Pharisees had to keep? 621. 621. 621 laws laws and oral traditions that they elevated in order to be considered a good Pharisee. So they went from one perspective of compromise to the ultra orthodox that you needed to follow all 621 of these laws in order to do that. And they weren't part of it. They were additions to, accesses on, addendums. Yes.
Were they pushing more Hebrew when they were teaching, or were they still teaching Greek? Because I've heard conflict when it came to that, because during that period you had three languages.
Right. Yeah.
But it's, what language were they really when they were teaching? Because they, in a sense, had the little outreach churches. Were they teaching in Hebrew, or were they still teaching in Greek, or were they using Arabic?
So this is a great question. And what do you think? So you think Aramaic? Okay. Okay, yeah. So the question is, for those of you watching online, thank you very much for repeating that. That were the Pharisees teaching in Hebrew? Were they teaching in Greek? Were they teaching in Aramaic? In looking through those different types of aspects, So we got all three answers in all three of those. As with a lot of these, there's people who are going to argue on both sides of the equation. I would, however, tend to believe, based on what we understand about the Pharisees themselves, who were trying to show allegiance to the orthodoxy of Judaism, that they probably would have shunned away from the Greek. Now you do have the Septuagint that's now available. We're now talking in first century in Jesus' time. The Septuagint is available, how widely spread it is. Remember too, and let me speak to that just really briefly, okay? Right? How did you get a copy of the scripture? How did you get a copy of it? It was written, okay? It was written, which means that some dude sat in a room with a bunch of other people around him, and I say dude, I mean guys, and I don't, guys, maybe girls, that he sat in a room with a bunch of people around him and he read, and they all transcribed. Okay? And you can get into textual criticism and why there's errors and just very simple reasons why, just because if you can imagine somebody talking, right? And as my old Greek professor, and Joe can attest to that, you know, he's an old Mississippi State graduate, and so you and I say dog, and he says dog, right? And so you can imagine that, you know, you're talking through that, just the differences of why there'd be mistakes. But one, you're probably talking about a 12% literacy rate in the entire country. So only 12% of the people knew how to read, period. And not to mention that trying to get a hold of the scriptures was very difficult. That's why they were in the synagogues. That's why they were there. There wasn't that many of them. People didn't have a copy in their house. The Ethiopian eunuch, you guys remember hearing about the Ethiopian eunuch reading out of Isaiah? Probably told you that guy was very rich or was part of a very wealthy family because he had a copy of the scriptures. So back to Pharisees and Sadducees and all of that. Just why are we doing this? We're giving you the characters and the lay of the land, okay, to know what's going on. So as you read over the scriptures or as you read over the New Testament, as we start to look through it, you get an understanding of the players in the game. So the Pharisees, 621 laws, oral tradition, walking throughout. They were the ones. You could study to be a Pharisee. Paul was a Pharisee among Pharisees. And so you could study to be a Pharisee. You could study, with that. You follow a rabbi and go through that and believe within a certain, these are sects or, offshoots of that. So with the Pharisees in there, you could study to be that. They were more of your local pastor kind of thing. They were in the synagogues. They were out in the areas. You could go and you could talk to them about, help to review the scriptures and get interpretation on that. And so there was more of them because you could study to be part of it. It wasn't something you were born into. And they were out in the communities looking and doing those things for the people. Did you have a question?
So those prayer shops where they had those hands on, I'm after each one of those hands were like 600, each one of them would make for a while. That's what I heard.
Yep. I mean, very well. Absolutely. Yeah. You mean then you have the tassels that are on the hems going down, that they're not 621 of those, but all reminders. So once again, something that starts off, and here's an interesting thing, okay, and this is what I love about looking at all of this stuff is that you sit here and you go, wow, man, how many people think that's crazy? How many people think, gosh, 621, and then they got like all of this stuff and those types of things like that. That's crazy. That's and that's way out of date. Yeah? Okay. How many people think you do stuff like that? How many people you think you do stuff like that? No? Right? No, but do crazy things outside of just because. Yeah. I'm crazy. Have it for the record. The man just said he was crazy. So that's okay. We're all a little bit crazy. But we look back at that and we think, oh my gosh, that's crazy. That's outrageous and all of that stuff like that. How many people pray before a meal? Why?
I've seen other Christians do it.
Did Jesus, how many people have gotten somebody gets upset at them if they don't? Great. Is it in scripture? No.
Jesus did it. It's Christian.
Before every meal? What's that?
It's like a Christian custom.
It's a custom.
I watched others,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, that's
Yeah.
what you do. Okay.
There you go. Yeah. How many people have done it just because everybody else has always done it, right? Absolutely. So you just realize when you start to look at certain things that there are certain things that we do, just traditions, and is there anything wrong with it? No, but when we elevate it to doctrine and we start to, why didn't you pray before a meal? What are you, not a Christian? All of that, right? That when you start to do that, yeah, you start to get it. Now, some dude probably thought out, going, how do I remember to pray all 621? Oh, you know what? I'll make a little shawl and this will just help me out. And then the guy said, oh, dude, that's a great idea. Let me just help me out. Awesome, cool, that's a great idea. And then all of a sudden, a generation later, where's your prayer shawl? Why aren't you doing that? That's what you need to do, you know, and in those, and you look at that and you're like, oh my gosh, this is how traditions get elevated to doctrine. And so it's really important. Why do we talk about all of these things? And this is why I think, you know, in Jesus and looking at the time, and he said that when the time was fulfilled, that Christ came onto the scene. And so you see where the temple is at. You see where, you know, in looking at the Torah and the laws that we're at, and we start to look at the people. So what were some of the other players in the game? So we talked about the Pharisees. We talked about the Sadducees. Has anybody else heard of anybody else? The Sanhedrin, right? So the Sanhedrin was a group most likely of religious leaders, mostly probably Sadducees, that were designed to make rulings because Rome gave them a certain amount of autonomy in ruling matters, especially related to their laws, because they had so many of them. Rome's like, I can't even deal with all of your whatever little laws that are, you know, you ate meat on Monday and did something crazy like that, right? So you had them. So they said, look, on these, and you remember that they talk about that you bind the yokes of men, but you miss the weightier matters of the law. That they became so focused on those little things and that. Okay, so we got the Sanhedrin. They're in there. Yes. The Zealots. Ooh, the Zealots, right? Jesus even had one, right? Simon the Zealot, right? The Zealots. Okay, so let's talk about the Zealots. What were the Zealots? What did the Zealots want? What do the Zealots want? Freedom? I think we can pretty much suffice it to say that every single Jew wanted freedom. What else? Once again, every single Jew probably wanted the Messiah to come. Yes. Come on, you got every other. No. You want to say it, it's on your lips. Come on.
They wanted their independence. No, actually, what they did want was any.
Okay, probably what every Jew wanted. So this is great because you guys are starting to pick up with like, oh, the Zealots, they wanted freedom. It's like they wanted freedom. It's like, yeah, not every Jew wanted freedom. Nobody loved being under Roman rule. Even the Sadducees who decided to side with them weren't happy about it, but it was the path of least resistance to keep their wealth. Everybody wanted the David days. Let me think back to the days of David, dancing naked in the streets. And I mean, not all that is right? The Zealots? I mean, define political. Were you talking about? Okay, so yes, the Zealots were more extreme and more militant. You're absolutely right. They were in that. Okay, what the Zealots wanted was the death of the high priest. How come? What had happened? So remember, the high priesthood is part of what sect? Okay, no, let's go back. Let's stay in today. What do we talk about? Who are they part of? Who said it? Say it again. They're the Sadducees. They're the progressives. They're the compromisers. So for those people that don't want to compromise, the Zealots believe that the high priest has been polluted. They believe that that they believe based on what they saw before, that God's presence has left. They're gone. And that God is not going to return until we cleanse the temple, the priests, get them out, part of that is returning of Israel back into their day. They don't believe that it's even possible for God. They're like, God ain't coming back until we get our stuff together. And so the zealots specifically were looking for the death of the high priest and the high priesthood. Was there a question over here? Yeah, they wanted them out because they felt that basically that there was sin in the camp, and that everything that we were doing, sacrifices, all this stuff was just a bunch of hogwash until we got stuff squared away.
Well, they also know that the priests had kind of more political appointment than an actual
Yep.
following the line of procedure.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, so they believed that everything that was happening in the temple and all that stuff nowadays was all for show. Yeah, that there legitimately wasn't anything in there. Yes. So those are the zealots, okay, that were in there. We can consider them, some consider them a terrorists or whatever in those types of things. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely would die for their cause. And in fact, so let's talk about that. Because as we walk through this, there's a couple of other groups that are in there, okay? The Hasmoneans. Anybody know about the Hasmoneans? Hasmoneans. 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 The Hasmoneans, there's some consideration that the Hasmoneans and the Zealots were part and parcel with one another. Okay? So the Hasmoneans, you hear about them specifically in AD 70, 71. Okay, so what happened? So as you're getting a lay of the land, as we're going through here, Jesus comes on the scene, right? He's dead, he's crucified, he's risen again. We're in the New Testament era. So this is all first century. We're all talking about first century Israel. Okay? And as things are going, as things are progressing, then we have what happens in AD 70. Come on, be confident. That's right. Yes, the temple was destroyed. In AD 70 was the destruction of the temple, was the end of the Second Temple era. What happens shortly after that is all of the Jews that were fighting, right? So whether they saw this at the time, and basically what happens is Rome's just, we're fed up with you. They're just, we're like, you know what, you're causing too much of a ruckus. You see, that's why Herod in there, and we'll talk about him in a little bit too, why Herod was so political, because he realized, man, this is just a hotbed. If I don't keep it under wraps, it's going to get out of hand, and Rome's just going to come through and just annihilate everything. So what ends up eventually happening is Rome's fed up with it. They're like, you guys, you can't govern yourselves. You can't deal with it. We're just going to come in, and we're kicking you all out. They basically are kicking the Jews out of Jerusalem. So they flee, and they chase them. The Hasmoneans flee to a mountaintop fortress called Masada. And it is there where they stay until the Roman legion, I believe it's the 12th Roman Legion, comes and encamps around Masada and waits for them. And if you've ever been to Masada, Masada is about 1,800 feet up a cliff. It is a mountaintop fortress. It was originally built by King Herod as one of 5 palaces that stretched between Jerusalem and Egypt. They were all within a day's journey of one another. Okay? Herod was very strategic, and he realized that if the Jews came out after him, he needed to get out of Dodge. So he built palaces on his escape route to Egypt. One of them was at Masada. Masada sits on a cliff, like literally it's like 1,800 feet high. You can take a tram up to it. You can hike up to it. I've done both. It's a lot of fun. It's a really cool place to see. And the crazy part is when you stand on the top of Masada and you look down at the floor, at the valley floor in the Dead Sea Valley, When you look down on them, you can still see the encampments from the 12th Roman Legion. It's crazy. You can still see the siege ramp that they built up the backside to eventually get themselves in to that area. To this day, we're talking 2,000, just about under 2,000 years ago. It's still there. It's still there, and you can still see it. And so they built a siege ramp up the back. And when they got to the Hasmoneans, they held out there. And when they built a siege ramp right up to the edge, and the Roman legion stopped for the day, and they went down to the bottom. And they said, we'll attack in the morning. And on that last night, they drew lots to see who would be the last person alive to kill themselves. And then basically, they all killed themselves. They all killed themselves until that last person, and then he killed himself. So when the Roman legion attacked the next morning, they found maybe a couple of women and children hiding in a corner or something like that. But everybody else was dead. And that marks the end of the Second Temple period, or that first century in those particular areas. Very interesting today, Israel, the IDF, which is Israel's army, when they bring their military through their graduation ceremony, they take them to the top of Masada and they show them everything, and they all swear never again will they ever be occupied. It's kind of a reminder. It's kind of this resounding thing of, we are never going to be occupied ever again, because of everything that they've been through over the course of years, in all of those things. So super crazy, but just really interesting is all this. So this is all of everything that's taking place when the gospel is going forth, and all of that stuff. In the midst of turmoil, in the midst of contention, in the midst of occupying forces with competing people. But here, what I want to show you, and this was one of the interesting things, and we'll take a little break here in a second, right? Or what do we got? 3:30? We go into a 4? Okay. Oh wow, Matt, you guys good? You need a stretch break or something? Absolutely. Wow, that's okay. Let me make this statement before we take a 5-minute stretch break. Is what you realize is that whether you align with the government and water down what you believe, or you become so focused on what you believe that you adhere to the word of what you believe, either way you miss the heart of God. That when you take his word and you line it up with your traditions, you miss the heart of God. And that's something that happens as prevalent for us today as it did 2,000 years ago. Take 5 minutes, and we'll come back and we'll finish up here real quick. So we got a couple of people, a couple of characters left that we need characters taken over in our play here, or our dramatic, that we're calling the dramatic events of the New Testament they were talking about. So we talked about the Hasmoneans, right? And them being that last group that was killed, or that basically killed themselves in suicide. Somebody at the door? Pizza! Somebody ordered pizza for San Isidro. So there you go. A couple people left to talk about. So we talked about Herod, right? So Herod, believe it or not, there's more than one. All right? So when you talk about Herod in the initial, we have Herod the Great. So Herod the Great was the one that came in that was right around 30 BC to around 4 or 5 AD. Right? Herod the Great was a brilliant strategist, as far as being in political power and all of that. He's the one that built all those palaces. He's the one that issued the decree to have Jesus killed. So he was the king of the Jews, or or the local ruler during that era, right? And so then he died in 4 or 5 AD, around in that area, and then you had a couple of others. You had Herod Archelaus, who was over an area. You had Herod Philippi, who was over an area as well. As they call it, 4 areas, or a tetrarch. You'll hear that as we go through there in those particular areas that governed that area. Really more of kind of in a puppet type of sense, because they were, you had Rome, you had Pontius Pilate, who was in the area, who was the procurator in all of those types of things. Yes. He had multiple. So you had Herod Archelaus, you had Herod Philippi, and I'm thinking I'm missing one other in there. But they kind of set, what they did is, instead of one being over the whole area, you had multiples being over different areas and all of that. And we'll find it when I bring up the maps and stuff like that for next week. We'll look at that more specifically in those areas through that. But Herod was the great, and his sons never really lived up to who he was in terms of his prowess in those areas. Pontius Pilate, we talked about him, right? Who initially didn't find anything wrong with the Jews here, or with Jesus, right? He was like, I don't find any fault in this guy, right? And really was would love to take, always taking a chance to stab at the Jews and kind of put them in their place. And he sent him to Herod, and he sent him back, but ultimately realized that if the political unrest got horrible, he'd probably lose his job. Now, that's not to say that you're fired. Hey, you know what? Here's your pink slip and go for away. They fired people differently in those days. They usually fired them with a sword through the heart. So it was kind of a permanent firing. You were fired from this world, kind of craziness. And Roman, you have to imagine, that at this particular point in time, the Roman Empire stretched from, from Spain and even up into Great Britain at the time in the west, all the way through almost to India in the east, and then down into northern Africa. So it's a huge area. In order to control that group, they had to be very strict and those types of things. And this is really important for you to realize too, because when they talk about the soldiers that fell asleep, when Jesus, the soldiers fell asleep and they stole him in the middle of the night. It's like, wait a second. You have to realize that if you're a Roman soldier and you fall asleep and your superior comes and finds you, he just puts a sword through you. There's no, oh, that's a verbal warning, or that's a written reprimand for you. No, you took a sword. You were done. It was one and done. So when you talk about those other things, and this is why the whole background and understanding in history makes a difference. Why is this important for you? Why is it important that the entire, all of the books of the New Testament were written in the 1st century AD? Why is that important? Anybody know, why is it important that all of the books of the New Testament were written within a 80 to 100 year span? Absolutely, yes. Eyewitnesses. Why is eyewitness important? Yes. Yes. Everything that you're saying, accuracy, credibility, validation. Why? Because if there was any problem, if anybody was ever going to dispute what was going on, they would be able to deal with it. If you guy said, I was going to write a book about Jesus rising from the dead. But people were there. They're like, no, man, 10 years ago, I was there. This is what happened. His body was still in there. You're just making it all up. So the importance of when it was written was absolutely necessary, because you realize that, and this is great. So when people talk to you, go, the Bible was just written by a bunch of people that got together about 300 or 400 years AD, and they just wanted to put some stuff together. That's not it. These people were eyewitnesses. They were eyewitnesses to an event. An event so dramatic, so life-changing that they went from scared people that ran away at the presence of a Roman group and guard, i.e. Garden of Gethsemane, to people willing to go to the cross and endure the very same fate that their Savior did. That's transformational. That's an event that totally took cowards and made them courageous. And understanding the times and all of those types and those things that were going on are super important with that. The only other ones that we haven't talked about are the Essenes. The Essenes. The Essenes are a small sect of people that took of what a monastic or ascetic lifestyle. Go ahead. What were you say?
They were in the desert, weren't they?
They were in the desert. Absolutely. They were in the desert. They retreated to the Judean desert, to the area around the Dead Sea. Okay, and they lived an ascetic lifestyle, which means that they was a very simple lifestyle. It was they took vows of poverty, vows of silence, and those types of and those things. And the Essenes were in an area called Qumran. It's where we get the Dead Sea Scrolls. So in 1947, a shepherd was in Qumran, in the area of Qumran, and he was looking for a sheep or a goat. It was a goat herder that he was missing. And he ended up throwing a rock over the hill to see if he could peg the goat, because he didn't want to climb down if the goat wasn't there. So he threw a rock over and he heard something go crash. He's like, what the heck was that? And he ends up scrambling down and he finds these clay pots, and in these clay pots are writings on skins. They were on skins. It wasn't on paper or parchment, but they were on skins, and ends up finding parts of the Old Testament within that, and the validation of that, as well as some other scriptures that are in there. And he comes and shows them to a guy. Little kind of cool little history part, right? Comes and shows them to a guy. He goes, "Hey, look at this. This is what I found. Is it worth anything?" They end up finding a scholar that's like, "Oh my gosh, these are scriptures. These are ancient, 2,000-year-old plus texts." And he's like, "I'll pay you for them." And because a lot of times too, the guys were burning them as like firewood. They're like, "Oh, this makes great. I'll burn this." I'm like, "Oh, don't do that. It's worth money." They're like, "Really? It's worth money?" He's like, "I'll pay you X number of dollars for every piece of these scriptures that you bring me." He's like, "Oh, okay, cool. Like, doesn't matter how big. No, just whatever you have, I'll pay you for them." Yeah. So what did they do? They went back to their buddies and they went, "Oh, dude, this is worth money. Here, you have a piece. Here, you have a piece. We're all getting paid. You have a piece, right?" And the guy's like, "No, I really want the whole thing." Right? Funny little story on that, but yeah. So, but those scriptures validate the time that when they were written. They were not written 300 or 400 AD. They were written, back in those times, back in that time. So there's validation, there's accuracy. That's why all the New Testament scriptures were written in that span of 100 years. So that because they were eyewitnesses to event, which means that people that were there could dispute it, and they didn't. And so that's why it's really important about that. There's some people that believe that John the Baptist was an Essene. And actually, if you go to Qumran in Israel, they talk about that there's some speculation or tradition that believes that John the Baptist was part of the Essenes. There's no proof of it, but the way he acted, the ascetic lifestyle, how he kind of described and talking about the return of Israel and all of those types of things, were very much an Essene-like type of just way of speaking. And so they think that he may not have, they don't think necessarily that he was part of the Qumran Essenes, but he could have been a part of another sect in those particular areas, in those things that are going on. We'll see in about AD, about 60 in all of those as things were growing on. And Nero comes in, you start to see the early persecution of the church that happens, also starting within Jerusalem as well as within out. and you think, oh my gosh, that's horrible, but that's actually, you know, Jesus said, in his Great Commission said what? What did he say? Great Commission. Go make disciples of all nations, right? Matthew 28. Go make disciples of all nations. What did the disciples do? They stayed. And it wasn't until they started getting persecuted that they actually started spreading out. And so you see that how God ever works in through all of these things as we work through the land. And this is where that division, right, where we talked about that they initially, does anybody know what the early Christianity was called? Starts with a W. The Way. Yes, very good. That Christianity was known as the Way, and they considered themselves part of they were a completion of the Jewish religion. But when things started to happen, such as things like the emperor worship, you know, and those different things, the Jews started like we don't want to be a part of you, because they're basically saying Jesus is Lord, there's nobody else. And they're like, yeah, okay, we're kind of trying to just get along here. And then it happens, they get blamed for the destruction of Rome, which probably wasn't their fault. That they said but Nero needed somebody to blame. Nero was the emperor in the time in Rome. And then Christian persecution starts through that. And the Jews make a distinct division that they are not part of us. We are completely separate. So those are kind of just the land and the layers and all of those things. Anybody have any questions about that? You know, literally, we're going to take in 4 weeks, which you could cover in like 16 weeks. But we're going to go through and just get the down and the dirty, and to really to realize that there's so much importance in understanding the lay of the land as we go through the books and those types of things. Questions, comments, thoughts? Okay. Yes.
I found a verse that actually explains why we pray. Verse 54 says that whatever we need to sanctify, first off, God knows God said, whatever we need to sanctify by our prayers. That sounds like a good concept. That was an excellent concept.
So I'm gonna ding you in public because you brought it in public. Okay? But I'm gonna give you a warning as pastors, as scholars, but whenever you take something you believe and you take a Bible verse to back it up, so in other words, you start with something that you think is right, and then you look to the Bible for it, it's called eisegesis, and I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm saying you're in dangerous waters. Because we're going to start to look through in this survey, you're going to look at literature, and you're going to look at who's writing it, and who is it written to. And to realize that if I write a letter to you, it's for you. It doesn't, but can Geraldine take out something that I wrote to you? And I'm not saying, once again, I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm saying we start to get into dangerous waters here. And this is where we start to believe things because of those issues and all of that stuff. So once again, the thing you're going to hear too is things that are descriptive and things that are prescriptive. And when we start to take things that are prescriptive, we start to narrow our view, and we start to then we start to put restrictions on things, and we miss the heart of God. Yes.
The proselytes, were they a mixture of proselytes in the New Testament?
Okay. So
Were they a mixture of Jewish and, I mean, what happened when they mixed? You did mention a couple of them that they were not Jewish and not something else.
okay. So you're proselyte?
Yes.
I'm not familiar with that term as far as a description of a people, as far as proselyting. You know, I mean, I know that more of as an action. I'd have to look up specifically what you're talking about in that. in those types of things? I mean, we'll look into, there's others groups that are like offshoots that come down, like Judaizers and Gnostics and those types of offshoots as we get through into the further in the epistles. Okay. Uh-huh. Perfect. Anything else? Good? Let me pray for you guys. And you all too. Watch. Father, I thank you so much that you give us just such a depth to your word, that your time was perfect for when you sent your son onto the scene. And we will see that as we start to look at all of the aspects around the New Testament and the who, what, where, and why behind it. I ask, Lord, that you would bless these men and women as they go through this day, and that you would give them just the heart to communicate your love that you have for people. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you guys.